friends, it's Jeannie, and I'm back to share another card with you today, focusing on a card that is solely die cutting and embossing, no stamping required. I'm using LDRS Creative Stitched Heart dies to create a bunch of hearts that are embossed. So what I do is take a piece of white cardstock, use the Wow embossing pad, and swipe it so that white cardstock is coated with that ink, and I add the embossing powder. For my first set of hearts, I am using Glassy Ocean, which is a smooth, opaque, pretty embossing powder that is just, it reminds me of the sea, and I just think it's really pretty. For my next two embossing powders, I chose two glittery ones with chunky white pieces in it, and I think that they're really pretty. The first color is called Monsterrat. I hope I'm saying that right, but it's really pretty. It's very glittery, and again, it has these little white specks in it. And when I'm adding it to the ink that's on the white cardstock, the white pieces aren't really sticking because they are a little chunky. So I will go in and add them and sprinkle them all over the piece of cardstock. And I just really wanted to incorporate the little white specks because they melt and it just makes everything so pretty. For any of the more glittery embossing powders that are a little bit more chunky, I like to heat set them from the bottom so the heat gun doesn't blow the glitter and the chunks everywhere. So once I melt most of it, I will turn the heat gun and put it right on top of embossing powder so it continues to melt. So for the second one, the color is called Bahama, and it's the same way. This one actually had the white chunks stick better to the white cardstock, so I didn't really have to add too many more. I just really like the white specks. It's my favorite part of these embossing powders. They just really add that little something to it, and it's just really pretty. So you can see that this one's super glittery as well, and heat embossing from the bottom just helps everything melt and it doesn't blow everything everywhere and create a big mess. So once I heat set a majority of this, I will move the heat gun directly to the top and it will make sure that everything else is melted. And it's just really, really pretty colors. I love the white specks and I wanted to incorporate them into this card. So once I have all my embossing powder swatches ready, I'm going to be die cutting the hearts. The LDRS stitched heart set has three different shapes. I went with the smallest and the middle size, and these will create a little pattern on my card panel. So once I die cut all of these, I decided that I wanted two of the smaller hearts using the Glassy Ocean color. I wanted one of the Montserrat and two of the Bahama colors. The Montserrat's a little bit lighter. It's like a very light teal color. And I wanted the sentiment to kind of pop and stand up against that. So if a darker color, it might get lost against the embossing powder, which Bahama is kind of a darker color, and I just really, really wanted the sentiment to pop. So once I have all these hearts, I kind of decide how I want to arrange them. Originally, I was going to go straight in a line on the side of the card panel, and it didn't fit very well. So I changed it up and I did it in a diagonal design. And I really like how they turned out. Of course, when you heat set embossing powders, it kind of warps the paper sometimes. And so it does make it a little bit harder to adhere to the card panel, but you just need a bit of liquid glue, press down hard, and it should adhere. With just the hearts on the card panel, it looked a little plain, so I wanted to add a bit of interest, and I do so by creating little strips of Glassy Ocean embossing powder. So I do the same thing as I did earlier, where I swipe the embossing pad onto the white cardstock so the ink transfers onto it, and then I add the embossing powder and I heat set it. I chose to do a large chunk so I can cut out strips, and I think that the strips will really tie the card all together. And because the Bahama and Montserrat colors have the white specks in it, I'm also going to trim out some white pieces of cardstock as well to intertwine with that Glassy Ocean. For the sentiment, I'm using another LDRS Creative die set. It's called Open Stitched Heart, and it has a sentiment that just says with love. I die cut that out, and directly on the heart, I'm adding the sentiment. I use the negative piece or the positive piece of the die cut, and that helps me line up everything so it's perfect. And I know it doesn't end up exactly perfect and exactly in the middle, but I think that it looks really good. And the black does really pop against this embossing powder and it makes the sentiment stand out. So that's exactly what I wanted, just the lighter color with the dark cardstock, and your eye just comes directly into the middle of the card because this heart will sit in the middle of the card. So I work on adhering the sentiment using liquid glue, and sometimes I do find that it's a bit difficult to adhere things to embossed surfaces, but for this one, it actually melts smooth, even though it does contain a bunch of glitter and a bunch of chunky bits. So it does work. It just takes a bit of patience and making sure that I press down on the letters to adhere before I let go. So I'm just going to rearrange them how I wanted it earlier, and it fits with a little bit of overlapping, but it works out. Like I had mentioned before, the paper did warp a bit, but as long as you add the adhesive all over and you press down hard and don't let go until it's adhered to the card panel, it should be fine. For the middle heart, I do decide to add a bit of dimension. I just wanted it to pop up a bit, so I will be adding foam tape to that middle heart. But for the two larger hearts that are in the corners and the two smaller hearts out of the glassy ocean embossing powder, I will be adhering it directly onto the card panel. Sometimes with these die cuts, you just want a little bit of dimension just to give that card a little something extra, and I think that this technique would be very interchangeable with any die cut shapes that you might have. I know that a lot of embossing powders that are really pretty that I have don't really work well with sentiments because sentiments are usually letters and they're very fine, and you can't really use embossing powders for them. So I think that this is a great way to incorporate some of your embossing powders that you haven't used because you can't just use them for sentiments. And you can use different shapes such as circles, squares, hearts, anything that you might have in your collection to create a very simple and quick card just by creating a bunch of embossing powder swatches and die cutting them out. For the interest that I'm adding onto the card, I am just trimming down the swatch of Glassy Ocean as well as a piece of white cardstock, and I'm trimming the strips down in different sizes, and the different sizes just kind of mimic the hearts because I have two different shapes here. I have different size strips, and that will add the interest onto the card because without the strips it does look rather plain and that something's kind of missing. And usually I would turn to embellishments, but I'm kind of focusing on embossing powders today and might as well go all in. So with the strips, I'm just using some adhesive tape for the larger strips, and for the smaller strip, I do not have any adhesive tape that thin, so I'm just going to add liquid glue. So I alternate a lot with uh, adhesive tape and liquid glue, whatever suits my mood at the time or whatever I have handy or whatever works. So you can totally mix and match any type of medium that you have because no one's going to know by looking at your finished product. I am kind of guesstimating where everything goes and if it lines up properly. I had not originally planned to have these strips on this card, so it's not going to be 100% perfect. But honestly, I don't think that anyone's going to notice that, and they're not going to be measuring and saying, like, oh, that's a little off. So I think that we are always our biggest critics, and sometimes we scrap cards because they don't look exactly perfect to us, but to an outsider, no one would notice the small things that we notice. And I think that that's part of my journey as a crafter is just letting those little things go, and you end up with a nice card. And most of the time, when I look back on my cards, I never notice the little things if I haven't been staring at it. So once I adhere all the strips, I am just going to flip it over and trim it off using a pair of scissors. And that is it for today's card. It is so simple. My first project focused on heat embossing only, and that was one of my very first cards where it was only a heat embossed card. And now this is a heat embossed card without any type of stamping whatsoever. So I hope you enjoyed today's card, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.